We've never had major success. Again, it sounds a bit of a weird thing to say, but if you look across the whole career span of Barclay James Harvest, there have never been any incredible #1 records that have come out of it commercially.
Barclay James Harvest were a progressive rock band whose career as one full band covered 32 years, 16 studio albums, thousands of concerts and gigs, whilst touring with the likes of Electrical Light Orchestra, Pink Floyd, Small Faces, T-Rex, Mott the Hoople and the Kinks, but never capturing the recognition, let alone the legacy of their contemporaries. This is the story of Barclay James Harvest. Barclay James Harvest's roots go back to the 60s, where two Oldham art students, John Lees and Stuart Wolstenholme, formed a band called The Sorcerers. At the same time, Les Holroyd and Mel Pritchard were in a band called Heart and Soul and The Wickeds. These two bands fused together to become the Blue Keepers in 1966, who started to play live gigs on a semi-professional level. This group of six then dissolved into a quartet, leading Les, John, Stuart and Mel to become a professional band and to rename themselves Barclay James Harvest, after picking names from a hat to decide this. Barclay because of the bank company, since they wanted to make money, James because of an old friend they used to play with, and Harvest since they practically lived in an 18th century farmhouse named Preston House. This is where, under the patronage of John Crowther, the first manager, they rehearsed and wrote songs for an entire year to perfect their craft. This lifestyle was captured in a short documentary for Granda TV. They then negotiated a one-off single deal with EMI's Parlophone, which was called Early Morning, which was released in 1968. This received acclaim and it with the opportunity to record radio sessions with John Peel, which in turn led to a record deal with EMI, who moved to their subsidiary, Harvest, for their progressive rock artists. Their initial single, Brother Thrush, was their first single for Harvest. In 1970 they released their first album, suitably titled Barclay James Harvest. This unfortunately failed to chart. Their subsequent tour was also a financial disaster. They then released once again in 1971 their second album. This was also an artistic letdown, but it did have their fan favourite Mockingbird. The same year, Barclay James Harvest and other short stories were released, followed the next year by Baby James Harvest. These both had little recognition, and they also had little success on the road, including another unsuccessful tour, this time in America. They parted company with EMI in 1973 after two singles titled When the City Sleeps and Breathless Under a False Name, Bombardi, with the last single for the label being Rock and Roll Woman. Their luck started to change for the better in 1973 when they signed with Polydor. They released Everyone Is Everybody Else that year. This seemed promising as it was more powerful and coherent than anything they had recorded with EMI, but this too failed to chart. However, in late 1974, they released a double live album, Barclay James Harvest Live, with a top 40 placement in England and more sales activity in Europe than they ever had. They then released Time Honoured Ghosts in 1975. This did even better and got to number 32 in England. This followed by October On. This was a top 20 album. In 1977 there was another chart entry, a live EP containing Rock and Roll Star and Medicine Man. Around this time EMI caught notice of this success and released a major fantasy. This was a John Lees solo album which had been recorded but not released after 5 years of existence. Their most accomplished album to date. Gone to Earth was released in 1977. By the end of the year they found themselves performing to arena-sized audiences. They then released 12 in 1978. This just missed the top 30 in England. However, more importantly, Wolstenholme announced his exit the next year. He was replaced by Kevin MacLeod and Colin Brown. The final tour with Wolstenholme, the live tapes, was then released as an album by Polydor. The same year, Eyes of the Universe was released. This became a moderate hit in England, but marked a flashpoint in Europe, especially Germany, where the two bands reside still to this day. On August 1980, arguably the highlight of their career, they performed to over 200,000 people at the Reichstag in Berlin, which was filmed and recorded. The subsequent album, Concert for the People, was their best-selling album in England, hitting number 15 spot in 1982. They then released Turn of the Tide in 1981. This was however less successful than their previous efforts. They then released Ring of Changes in 1983. This spawned their last charting single, Just a Day Away. They then released Victims of Circumstance. This charted low. The next album was Face to Face. This too was not as successful in England. Next was Welcome to the Show. This suffered the same fate as the previous album. They then released Caught by the Light in 1993. Then came the last studio album created by Barclay James Harvest, River of Dreams, in 1997. Despite their recent downfall in their homeland, their popularity in Europe only continued to grow. In 1998, the decision was made to split the band into two different groups due to creative differences between the members of the band. John Lees and Stuart Wolstenholme formed John Lees Barclay James Harvest. This derivative also featured Craig Fletcher, Kevin Whitehead and Jez Smith. Under the name Through the Eyes of John Lees, they remixed new and classic songs from their former band, and in 1999 released Nexus. In 2006, they recorded and released the live album Legacy. This was recorded at Shepherd's Bush Empire in London. In 2013, they released North. This was very well received and became Cherry Red's biggest selling album of the fourth quarter of that year. Les Holroyd and Mel Pritchard formed Les Holroyd featuring Barclay James Harvest, and in 2001 recording Revolution Days. Mel unfortunately died suddenly of a heart attack in 2004. This was followed in December 2010 with the suicide of Stuart, who had been suffering with depression for many years. This leaves their two variants with only one original band member between them. Both groups continue to tour in Germany, and there have been countless compilation albums released, many in more recent years, which cements their music into the hearts of their fans. This proves what a dedicated fan base they continue to have. This goes to show a band does not have to have total recognition with their music industry to be adored by millions.
I first heard about them when my father brought back a vinyl of theirs. Yes, it was a copy of October On. Yeah. Their music always used to make me feel relaxed, usually. You know, it was something that I could chill to. I like their unique style of I suppose, like the whole progressive rock kind of movement of the time. You know, like a lot of bands on the record label they're on was Harvest, where you know, they were doing progressive rock. I mean, you had bands like Deep Purple doing like jazz rock and stuff, and then you know, they were doing their own thing. You know, it was much more, you know, softer, relaxed, you know, unique. I think the only one I could really compare them to, I'd say something like maybe some of the early stuff by Deep Purple, something like Fairport Convention, mainly for the kind of folky, stylish kind of thing. I think they had their day, they had their hits already, and you know, it's a style of music that doesn't really work with the generation anymore. You know, like this generation, you know, they got their own music, and just as generations before Barclay James Harvest, you know, there were people who were into classical music who hated Barclay James Harvest, you know, and stuff like that. So, yeah, the time has moved on. They've always been a band that's had, like, almost a clear identity, but they like to experiment, of course, every now and again, like every band does. But, you know, I think mostly the core concept has been the same. They're a very fun band, you know, to play live, and I saw it recently, so it was the version with Les Holroyd. It was a fun experience, actually, yeah. I believe Barclay James Harvest doesn't really have much of a future, because it's a band that's past its prime. You know, it's the same with a lot of bands of the age. You know, like Deep Purple, they're still releasing stuff, not gonna chart, but yeah. And then you have you know, stuff like David Bowie. His last album charted only because he died. Their fandom is like every band. Of course, they have a fandom. They have a dedicated following. I think that every band, you know, deserves some. Art is subjective, so you know, if you don't like it, there's always going to be someone who does.